Okay, so here we are with Annie Murphy Paul, and I've actually mentioned you already on this podcast because I was so excited about your book. And I said that I think it's my favorite book of 2022, even though it came
Oh.
out in 2021. I read it in 2022.
Mhm.
And I read a lot of books. I read, probably one book a week for this podcast.
Mm.
And what I am excited about it is that I think that it not only the title of it is the extended mind, but it extended my mind in so many ways. And I feel
Mm.
like a lot of times I read things that have already been said,
Mm.
and you were able to say things in a really fresh perspective that I apply now to my clinical practice, to my parenting, and to my training of professionals. So I'm thrilled to talk with you today about the extended mind.
Well, thanks, Diana. I mean, two things that come to mind when I listen to you give me that lovely introduction. One is that it's so important to me as a writer to be saying something new. I mean, if I'm just sort of rehashing what's already out there, like why bother, So it took me kind of a long time to find my way to this idea, and it's in a way, it's ironic that we should be talking about fresh ideas because actually this is a borrowed idea. I borrowed it from a couple of philosophers. It's not my idea, but I do hope, and this speaks to the second thing I was thinking, that I was able to take an idea and make it really practical. That was also really important to me to not have it be an ivory tower or pie in the sky kind of thing, but something that people could really put to use in their everyday lives. And I've found that to be the case in my own life. So it's really nice to hear that that has been the case for you too.
So your book takes the concept of the mind, which we think of it as being in the head, which psychology is guilty of, and you take it out of the head and into all of these different places. So the thinking with our bodies, thinking with the spaces that we're in, and then also thinking with our relationships. And I think it would be nice for us to go through each one of those categories, and maybe you can talk a bit about some of the research behind thinking in these different ways within those categories, but also talk about, like you said, how you're applying this in your life. And I can give a little bit about how I'm applying it in my life as well, how I'm thinking about things differently with the extended mind. Let's start with our bodies, and in that's I was so excited that you started with that spot. So, uh, how do we think with our bodies? How does our mind extend to that?
Yeah, I think it's an important place to start. It's almost like the most important and fundamental place to start, and yet so many of us don't really think with our bodies. And I'm as guilty of this, or more guilty of this than anyone. And I always say that writers kind of write what they need to learn because I am myself someone who lives in my head a whole lot. I've been a freelance writer for 20 years and I spend my day thinking about ideas and working with words, and so it's very easy for me to forget that I have a body. And I think that that's even more of a danger now that we're on screen so much. We can spend an entire day not even relating to another body in person, but actually just kind of being in our head. So what I mean when I say that we can think with our bodies and should think with our bodies is that we should be, I don't want to say should, it would benefit us so much if we were able to remember that we can think not only with our brains, but with the internal sensations that are always flowing within our body. That's a capacity that scientists call interoception, that we can think with the gestures of our hands and not just with the verbal language that we utter. And also that we can think with the physical movements of our body, the gross, big movements of our bodies, as well as hand gestures. I'll just say one more word about how I've applied that in my own life. The interoceptive research has been especially profound for me because I find that our world is so busy and so full of stimuli that's always reaching out to grab our attention that it's very easy to always be looking outward. And there's this internal flow of sensation that's very quiet and subtler, than all the noisy stuff outside. And so it's very easy to forget that that's there. And once I started reading about the benefits of tuning into our interoception, I started making time to pause and kind of ask myself not only what's going on in my external world, but what's going on in my internal world. And once you do that, it's just amazing how much there is to feel and how much there is going on, on the inside. And it really is a capacity that we can develop and cultivate and become ever more sensitive to. And so that's been a really wonderful discovery for me.
So I highlighted in the book where you wrote that clinical psychologists are the champions of
Yes.
interoceptive awareness. And I was like,
Yes.
yes, not only are we the champions, we're also, it actually is a hard thing to be so
Mhm.
interoceptively aware. Sometimes
Mhm.
I have felt like, the movie Ghost,
Mhm.
where I think it's Whoopi Goldberg goes inside of Patrick Swayze's body or something like that, and then and then comes out of
Vaguely,
it
yeah.
again and feels so
Mhm.
exhausted.
Mm.
I feel like that with my clients. That
Mhm.
that I have this awareness of, not only what's happening in my body, but I also try on what's happening in their body. And
Yeah,
interoceptive awareness is not only helpful for us as individuals, it's helpful for us to be able to empathize and have
totally.
compassion and be able to understand what's happening
Yes.
with others as well.
Yes.
So I love
Yeah.
that part of the book where you talk about the benefits of interoceptive awareness in our relationships.
Yeah, what researchers call social interoception. Yeah, I love that too because it made so much sense to me to understand the mechanism by which that happens that we don't have direct access to what another person is thinking. You can't literally go inside the head of your patient or your client when you're working with them. So how do you know what they feel? The reason I said that clinical psychologists are the champions of interoception is that you guys actually are trained and actually cultivate your ability to sense within your own body what your patient is feeling, and what they may not even be able to say at
Yeah.
that point. And so it's so interesting to hear you say that actually it can be exhausting, or it can be, you're really almost taking on the emotions of somebody else because of your extreme sensitivity. And I think it's interesting to think about how medical doctors who have to often, sometimes have to cause pain in order to speed healing. Like if you have to give someone a shot or draw blood, or a surgeon has to actually cut through someone's flesh, they actually become very adept at subduing their interoception. Because if they felt what their patient felt every time they did a procedure, they'd burn out pretty fast. So, but for you to do your job well, you have to cultivate and make in that capacity of interoception ever keener. So it's a big ask, and it's really like an admirable thing that people in your profession do on behalf of their patients.
Well, I've worked with it over the years to be able to do it without it, getting into that fatigue state. But early on, my early research was actually on interoception, and it was on interoceptive awareness. I worked with eating disorders, and what's interesting about folks with eating disorders, and especially folks with anorexia, is not only have they shut off their interoceptive awareness of their hunger and fullness, they have anorexia, like they don't actually feel hunger anymore. They also shut off their emotional awareness. So it's alexithymia, which is the inability to name or even understand your own emotions. So part of the recovery from that is training people to become more interoceptively aware of what's happening inside of your body. And there's so much that happens in there. There's emotions that happen in there, and sensations and all sorts of things. So it was really fun to learn about how actually having that awareness increases our cognition and helps us think better. And some of the research that you talk about with stock exchange folks, because I can use this now with my clients. I can be like, it's not only just, beneficial for you in this
Yeah,
way,
it'll
it's
make you
also going to
money.
make you, yeah, well, it's make you make money, but be more effective at your job.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of thoughts there. One is that increasingly researchers are connecting all kinds of mental health conditions to impaired interoception, not just eating disorders, but also addiction, the cues that lead people to seek out drugs or alcohol, and also anxiety and panic disorders, which can be a case of kind of being oversensitive to the body's signals and assuming that a little shortness of breath means that you're not able to breathe, and then that leads to a spirals into a panic attack. So working with our interoception is really important for our psychological health and well-being, and for our emotional lives, as you suggest, because our emotions, researchers are increasingly aware that our emotions are constructed from the basic building blocks of our bodily sensations. And when we know that, we can kind of intervene in the process of constructing an emotion and reinterpret the bodily signals of, say, a racing heart or sweaty palms, not as so much as anxiety as excitement, and being how your body's getting you ready for a challenge, which is actually something, speaking of how we apply this in our everyday lives, is something I do before I give a talk. For example, before I engage in public speaking, I'll say, instead of saying, I'm so nervous, or calm down, which is like telling your body not to do what it knows how to do and not to respond to the situation, which is no good. I tell myself, I'm so excited. I'm really psyched for this, and it works. It may sound a little silly, but it really works. But then back to the stock traders that you mentioned, that was a study that looked at the interoceptive acuity or sensitivity of stock traders on the London trading floor versus the interoceptive accuracy of just sort of people off the street, a control group. And in fact, not only were the stock traders more interoceptively aware, they were more in tune with their body signals. Within the group of stock traders, the ones who were most successful were the most interoceptively aware. So even in this enterprise, this activity where we think that, a big brain, it's all about having a big brain and sort of crunching the numbers. It turned out that in the really fast paced and dynamic work of betting on stocks, it really helps to have access to that sort of gut instinct. And the more you're tuned into your body, the more you can draw on that stored wisdom that is signaled to you by your bodily cues.
Yes. So more reasons for those stock traders to take up yoga practice, or for
Exactly.
clinical psychologists to take on a second career of stock trading, maybe.
I
um,
know, right?
yeah, right. So this is a super skill. Some of the other things that were really new and fresh to me that I'm applying in my practice, and this has to do with the body too, was the gesture aspect.
Uh-huh.
I consult with therapists a lot, so
Mm.
I was working with this therapist who was talking about one of her patients. And while she was talking about her patient and how she felt so stuck with this patient, she was doing this gesture of like almost like pulling, as if she's pulling on a rope. She's
Uh-huh.
like,
Uh-huh.
I get in with the patient and I feel so stuck with her. And I just
Mm.
want to get her to
Mm.
change. And she's pulling on this rope. And
Mm.
I was reading your book at the time and I started pulling on the rope. And I was like, it's sort of like you're doing this with her. And it was a way
Uh,
of actually
uh-huh.
identifying what was going wrong in the therapy session, even though she
Mm.
wasn't saying what was going wrong. But
Mhm. And
obviously, it was
might
going
not have
wrong.
had conscious access really,
Yeah,
but it
that
was
she was pulling.
being belied by
Yeah.
her gestures. That's so interesting.
So
Wow.
tell me about gestures and how we think with gestures and why they're so helpful also with kids too, was the other aspect that was interesting.
Yeah, that was the gesture literature was incredibly fascinating to me too, because again, as a writer, I focus so much on language, spoken language and written language. So it was fascinating to learn that actually, rather than being a sort of clumsy tag along, to our verbal language, gestures are often a couple steps ahead of where we are in terms of being able to articulate and verbalize what we're thinking. Our gestures are actually kind of leading the way and may even be informing what we're saying. And we know that in part because when people are inhibited from gesturing, when they're prevented from gesturing, they think less cogently. They come up with less complete explanations for things. Their speech is less fluid. So gesturing is actually an integral part of the communication process. It's not just about communicating your thoughts to other people. It's actually it's an integral part of your own thinking process. And what strikes me about the story you just told, Diana, is that the brain evolved not to think about symbolic concepts and abstract concepts, but rather embodied experiences that we have in the real world. And so the brain tends to translate abstract concepts into like it tends to use embodied metaphors. So that the therapist that you were discussing the patient with, she was translating her experience, which maybe was hard to put into words, into this bodily experience of pulling on that rope and not getting where she wanted to go. And that was so evocative of her experience, but not something she could put into words at that moment. She could just express it with her hands, and was able to communicate that to you. And you picked up on that, which is so interesting. That's one thing that we don't tend to do is pay enough attention either to our own gestures or to other people's gestures. But there's a real wealth of information that's there if we start paying attention.
Oh, yeah, it's changed my therapy practice. It's also
Hmm.
it's changed how I'm working with kids because of what you shared around language development and the
Hmm.
importance of gesturing
Hmm.
with children to help them develop their language, as well
Hmm.
as
Oh,
my
hmm.
online trainings. I'm using a lot more gesturing, even as now as we're talking, I'm trying to
Uh-huh.
use more
Uh-huh.
gesturing because of these
Uh-huh.
suggestions that you've made based
Yeah.
on research in terms of it extending our cognition and benefiting our cognition.
Yeah, no, the idea I'm thinking of the research on the importance of using gesture with children, along with lots of verbal expression, which of course I think we all know about at this point. It's important to talk to kids and have them just be bathed in verbal language, but it's also important to be gesturing with them. And in fact, disadvantaged kids, there's a sort of gesture gap that shows up along with the better known word gap, where kids in less fortunate socioeconomic circumstances tend to see many fewer gestures than more affluent kids. And so they end up, that's part of the explanation for why they end up having smaller vocabularies when they start school. Another piece of the research around kids and gesture that I found fascinating was this idea of mismatch, that kids will often be gesturing with their hands in a way that shows their emerging understanding before their verbal language reflects that emerging understanding. And it's when kids have that mismatch, when their gestures are saying one thing and their words are saying another, that they're especially receptive and open and ready for instruction. If they get instruction at that moment, they're ready to run with it, you know. So when teachers and parents can pay attention to what how kids are moving their hands and what they're saying, and notice that when there's a gap between those two things, that's what a moment when we can intervene really effectively.
Yeah, it's great. So, thinking with our bodies, another aspect that you talk about is thinking with our spaces. And of course, this makes me think about my therapy space, think about my home environment, think about all sorts of spaces, and how much our spaces impact our cognition, impact our mood. You talk about natural spaces and built spaces. So let's start with natural spaces, because there's certain things that I intuitively have done in my office. I always have fresh flowers in my office. I when I was setting up my office, I put it so that my client would be facing the doors that open up to outside as opposed to facing the other way. So there's just ways that I kind of intuitively sensed it out. But I think I was following some of the research that you outlined so well around natural spaces and their impact on our thinking.
Yeah. Well, from here, your space looks like a treehouse almost. Like you have a lot of natural light and view. So, in a way, it's to respond in the way that you have to the outdoors and to want to bring it indoors is really following the blueprint of our evolutionary history. You know, because human beings evolved in the outdoors. All our perceptual systems, you know, were they evolved to process the kind of information and the kind of stimuli that we encounter outside. And so this world where that we inhabit now, where we're inside almost all the time, either in our cars or inside buildings or in an urban built up kind of setting, is very unnatural in the sense that those aren't the conditions under which we evolved. And so I think you're right, Diana, that we have a kind of intuitive sense that when we go outside, and this is another thing I loved learning about, because I love learning the why of why something, you know, you may believe something or feel something, but then to know why is so interesting. So we all have that sense, or many of us have that sense, that when we go outside, it's calming, it's relaxing. We know that if we spend some time outside, we feel restored and relaxed. But why is that? It's because again, the kind of stimuli that we're taking in outside, all those beautiful green leaves and the clouds in the sky and the grass and the flowers that we're looking at, those sights and sounds are really easy for our brains to process. It's really effortless to process those things, unlike the very hard edged attention that we have to bring to, say, a screen full of symbols and numbers. So we're kind of refilling our attentional tank when we're outside. We're refilling the tank of our attentional resources. So then when we come back inside and we need to focus on our work, whether it's working with a patient or turning to a screen, we have more of those attentional capacities at our disposal. And so I find it useful to think about not just spending attention or directing it or managing our attention, but actually when are you restoring your attention? When are you refilling that tank? We think so much about the demands on our attention, but not so much about how to replenish the supply.
I loved what you wrote about fractals in nature,
Yeah.
and it just makes me so the fractals being those repeated patterns, and I'm looking at like the sunflowers behind me or
Mhm.
a succulent that
Mhm.
we in Santa Barbara we have a lot of succulents because we have no water.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
but how just resting our eyes on fractals changes the way
Mhm.
that we feel. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, fractals are repeated patterns, often repeated, the same shape, repeated at different scales. So if you think of like a fern, the frond of a fern, there's that same sort of scroll-like shape, but it's repeated from the tiniest leaves at the tip all the way to the big leaves at the bottom. And the reason that the reason scientists believe that fractals are so calming and restorative for us to look at, and fractals are found everywhere in nature, in the ocean waves and coastlines and mountains and clouds, and also most visibly in plants. The reason they're so relaxing for us to look at is that scientists increasingly think that the brain is like a prediction machine. It's always trying to predict what will come next. And with fractals, it's very easy to make that prediction because it's one shape after another, just sort of varying in size. So again, the brain, it has this very satisfying and very effortless experience of predicting what it will see next, and then having that prediction come true over and over again when we're outside in nature. So when we're in an urban space, the reason we can find that so jangling and jarring is that there may be an old elaborate building next to a sleek, modern one. It's like our brains never know what's going to come next. So that's one reason why we find being outside so much more relaxing and restorative than navigating an urban setting.
Beautiful. So that's a good tip for all of us that when we can take these sort of like mini restorative
Hmm.
moments to go outside, look at a repeating pattern in nature, and that kind of gives our brain a little bit of a rest. And a lot of times we go to our phone to scroll
Right.
thinking that we're going to get a rest, but that's
Right.
not actually giving us that restoration.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Because there's another part that's about having the experience of awe, which is much more likely to happen in these vast spaces of nature than in looking at our tiny little screens. There's also a benefit in terms of what's known as cognitive offloading. I find it interesting that we tend to celebrate the ability to do things in our heads. We admire people like a chess grandmaster who can plan out multiple moves in advance and do that all in their heads, or a mathematician who can do really complex operations in their heads. But in fact, it's usually more efficient and effective to get ideas and information out of our heads and onto physical space where we can then relate to that information differently. We can manipulate it and move it around like it's a three-dimensional object, which we can do with post-it notes, for example. I'm a really big fan of post-it notes when I'm planning out a chapter or an article. And we can also navigate through a landscape of information when we've sort of spread it all out, like on a big whiteboard or a big bulletin board. And when we do that, we can bring in all these embodied resources that otherwise get wasted when we just have information inside our heads, like our spatial memory, for example. Human beings have this really powerful spatial memory where we remember where things are. And so when things are sort of stably located, once we've sort of sorted them out into categories or columns, then we can use our spatial memory and sort of navigate through that landscape of information like it's a three-dimensional landscape Whereas things on our computer, our windows and our scrolling and our kind of zooming in and out, we lose a sense of the physical placement of things. And so that can be more cognitively draining and less helpful in terms of thinking about complex information.
There's two ways in which I use this as a psychologist. One is there's actually this really useful tool called a chain analysis that was developed in dialectical
Hmm,
behavior therapy. And
hmm,
what you do in a chain analysis is you write down like a problem behavior, and you
hmm,
actually take a piece of paper, you sit down next to your client, and you're like, "What's your problem behavior?" And you're like, "I yelled at my kids this morning." And then you go through and you make these little like links, like chains,
hmm,
going back in time and going forward in time.
hmm,
And as you make the links and chains in the chains going back in time, you have the client write down in those links what were the links that led up to
hmm,
that yelling at your kids. So it could be like, I
hmm,
didn't have breakfast and I read this email. And then you also look at the links in terms of the consequences. And
hmm,
when you
hmm,
map that out with a client and
mhm,
you can actually see these links on a piece of paper, then you
hmm,
have a better sense of where you could have intervened. And then
hmm,
also the consequences and how they are related to the thing that you want to change. It's super helpful. And I never
hmm.
had an understanding of that. What we're actually doing there is thinking about it outside of our heads and actually on paper.
I wonder if putting it down on paper also allows people to take a step away from it,
Yeah.
it gives a helpful kind of psychological distance that they wouldn't get if it were still inside them, inside their heads.
And break it up, because
Mhm,
I think a lot of times we think of our experience as just one big thing, and when you can put it on paper, sort of like the Post-it note, when you can make it sort of these moving parts,
mhm,
then you can work with it better. But then the other way that I use that as a therapist, and your work kind of helped me see this, is um, in actually writing down things and moving them about in the office. Like, how close is your critic to you right now? Is it right up next to your
hmm,
eyes, or is it
hmm,
like,
hmm,
all the way
mhm,
across the room? And
huh,
in that, using space in that way as well, I think is another way of kind of communicating metaphorically about
mhm,
what's happening internally in our experience. Because sometimes our
yeah.
thoughts can feel really right up close, and sometimes they can feel further away. So
And those are really grounded, embodied metaphors too. They really draw on the body's feelings of, is this person or this, mental image close to me or far away? Like that seems really it seems to really draw on the body's resources in a skillful way.
yeah. So if you're the type of person that wants to put things on Post-it notes and make lists and diagrams and all of that, it's actually a helpful cognitive tool. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you, that you can't just keep it all in your
No.
head, which I think some of us feel that way.
Yeah, and that's something I wanted to push back against with this book is the idea that thinking only counts if it goes on inside your head. Thinking is useful and valuable wherever it happens. And in fact, some of the most adept thinkers, experts in their fields tend to be more adept and more frequent users of thinking outside the brain. That's a skill that they have acquired that I think the rest of us could emulate when we want to think well as too.
In your book, you talk about everyone from Jackson Pollock to Darwin to all these
Mhm,
different big thinkers and creators, and
mhm,
how they've used these different practices of thinking outside in different
mhm,
ways. One more thing I want to touch on, and more as we're talking about thinking in spaces, is just our workspaces and what you
mhm,
learned about in terms of what are the most beneficial ways to set up our workspaces. Because
mhm, mhm.
we started out with like walls and getting your office, and then we moved to these big open floor plans where everyone can talk
Right,
to everyone and hear everyone else on the phone. And
right.
what did you learn through your research there about what
Yeah.
is the best way to set up our workspaces?
The book makes a really passionate case against the open office, because it's so poorly designed, to work with the human tendency to be distracted by auditory and visual stimuli. I wonder if the pandemic kind of took care of the open office because lots of us are working at home these days. But then again, it may actually have accelerated some elements of that trend towards an open office because I'm hearing from people in corporate settings and organizational settings that people don't have their own desks anymore because people aren't coming in every day, and so there's a trend afoot that I'm kind of concerned about, which is some people call it hot desking or hoteling, which means that instead of having, your own desk or your own office area, you kind of grab whatever space is available, and it wasn't where you were yesterday and it won't be where you are tomorrow. And that worries me because so much of what I discovered in the research for the chapter on thinking with spaces is that it's really important for us to have a space that we feel to work and think in a space that we feel like is ours, that we feel like is our turf, and that we have power and control over. And also that we've filled with our own, what researchers call evocative objects, these signs and cues and symbols that either remind us of who we are, that are cues of identity, or that remind us of groups that we belong to, valued groups that we belong to. So cues of belonging. And so, fortunately for those of us who work at home, we have control over our space, and that's something we can readily put into action in our space at home. And I've even heard of people in these new kind of hybrid offices having a locker, where they keep photographs of their family or the little objects that really are meaningful to them. And they take them out and array them on their desk, whatever desk they're at that day. So I think there are ways to work with even the new pandemic era arrangements.
Yes, what was it, the CEO of Airbnb that is now saying that everyone can go in his office, they can all work from home, and kind of encouraging people to go to Airbnbs and work in all these different places around the world. But that's wonderful. There's something
Uh-huh.
freeing about that, but then there's also something that's ungrounding about it, in
Hmm.
terms of when we have the cues that remind us of work or remind us of belonging, or remind, for me, it's like I know that when I walk in my therapy office space, this is where I do therapy, and there's like a different feeling that washes over me when I
Hmm.
come into this space, as opposed to when the times that I have done therapy in my guest room, or it feels
Hmm.
a little bit ungrounded to me. So in our home spaces, where I see people having more trouble, is it's not their coworkers walking in on them, it's like their dogs and the FedEx
Yeah.
person and their kids and the
Yeah.
refrigerator that's right there and so distracting because you can get a snack anytime you want. Those kinds of things are challenging for folks. But
And that speaks, I think, to the fact that we have many identities, and the things that are around us, the objects and spaces that we see can cue or prime one or more of those identities. And so some of the trouble that we may have working from home is that, being home primes this identity of being someone who's cleaning up the house or who's taking care of kids, and not the professional identity that in that moment we want to be inhabiting. So I think that's
yes.
another reason to think about when you are working, what are the objects, what are the signs and symbols that you see around you, and are they affirming that particular identity of a worker, a thinker, a creative person, whatever it is you need to be in that space.
Yes, my husband's been home this past week working from home because he had a little bit of a cold and he didn't want to go in and spread it. And it was like 10 o'clock in the morning and I was working on something and he came and he said, I have all this work to do. I think I'm going to roast some coffee.
Right.
I was like, right, because you're
Right.
home. And isn't
Yeah,
it,
of course.
more fun to be in the identity of a coffee roaster than
Of course.
than do those emails? So yeah, we have
Mhm.
to kind of adopt that identity. Okay, so I don't want to neglect the third area that you talk about in terms
Mhm.
of thinking outside the brain, and this is in the area of relationships. So of
Mhm.
course, I loved these chapters so
Mhm.
much,
Mm.
and in the relationships with experts, the relationships with our peers, and the relationships with groups within
Mhm.
groups. So
Mhm.
let's talk a little bit about experts, because one of the things that you talk about there is the real benefit of mimicry and
Yeah.
copying. And
Yeah.
that's something that therapists do a lot of already,
Uh-huh.
but maybe in other areas it's not seen it so positively.
Yeah, I'm sure that I would think therapists do a lot of mirroring, right?
Yeah.
Literal mimicking and mirroring of other people's facial expressions, as a way of, first of all, making them feel heard and seen, and also, as we were saying earlier when we were talking about interoception, as a way of getting a little piece of what they may be feeling. And then there's the larger sort of matter of imitation and mimicry as sort of the fastest and most efficient and most effective way to mastery of a new domain. And it's unfortunate that imitation doesn't get used as a form of learning as often as it should be, because I think our culture has such a bias towards originality, towards being the first to do something. Whereas I think older generations, going back to the ancients, to the ancient Greeks and Romans, knew that imitating the masters is the best way to develop that skill for yourself. And once you've done that, then you can put your own twist on it, your own. You can get your own, put it your own take on it. But there's nothing shameful or embarrassing or morally compromised about imitating. As long as we're all clear that it's meant to be a process of learning.
So one way to learn from experts is through imitation. I think athletes do this, right? They
Uh-huh.
think about my young athletes, my Stephen Curry and how he shoots the ball, and they imitate
Uh-huh.
that, even though And so
Right.
it's a way of learning. I think in the field of therapy, the way we do that is through role play. Another area of learning and cognition is peers, and I was
Hmm.
interested in some of the research there of like how much social cognition, as social creatures, think so much better when we're in
Yeah.
groups and when and peers than when we're on our
Yeah.
own, even though we think of thinking as being an individual thing.
Exactly. I think we've got that really backwards. We think if we're doing real thinking, serious thinking, that we should go into a room by ourselves and close the door and be still, right? All these things that are actually not facilitative of good thinking, because when we're socially interacting with other people, there's this whole suite of cognitive processes that get activated that remain dormant when we're thinking by ourselves, because human beings are such fundamentally social creatures. And that sociability doesn't just come out, during happy hour or during lunchtime. We're social all the time. And so the more we can leverage our social natures in the service of thinking and learning, the better off we are. And so I write in that chapter about the value of bringing in social activities like storytelling and debating and arguing and teaching other people, teaching our peers, and using those social activities to kind of supercharge our own thinking.
So how I'm applying that to my therapy practice after I learned about that, especially the teaching ones, like how do I use teaching to instill skills into my clients, is one of the things I've asked clients to do is go home and tell somebody about something that you learned in this therapy
Uh,
practice and share it.
uh,
Especially with like
uh-huh.
when I work with teens, it's like go home and tell your parents about
Mhm.
something that you learned, and it's so true that as soon as you become into that role of teacher, it just strengthens your learning so much
Mhm.
more as
Mhm.
opposed to
Mhm.
being the recipient of it. So it's things relational and make it in a way that you are teaching it if you want to learn it. It's the
Mhm.
best way to learn.
Mhm.
What about
Mhm.
what about groups? I love the term that you said, the group think, but group mind, which is a little bit different.
Yeah, and groupiness,
And
which is
groupiness.
a real term,
Yeah.
meaning, because we've all been on teams or in groups that never really cohere, that just remain sort of a bunch of individuals, and then we've all been, I think, part of, groups that really manage to create something like a group mind, where you're thinking together, you're thinking in sync, and you have a collective intelligence that is greater than the intelligence of any one of the members. And so then the question becomes, how do you create that sense of groupiness? I really came away from the research with a strong belief that it requires people being in the same space at the same time,
Mhm.
engaged in the same activities. So that's a real kind of thing for us to think about when we do conduct so much of our lives online these days, that the value of being in person, with people, really can't be overstated. The richness of the signals that we exchange with each other when we're in person, when we're, body to body, we're sharing the same space, just can't really be replicated online.
Yeah, that I really missed with online therapy. And people, actually the
Mhm.
research shows that online therapy is as effective as
Mhm.
in-person therapy, but I still prefer in person.
Mhm.
There's,
Mhm.
I like seeing the whole body. I like to see the foot that's tapping, even though the rest of the
Uh-huh.
body is completely still, or, walk into a space and where they choose
Mhm.
to sit down. Are they sitting at the far end of the couch so they get as much distance
Mhm.
as possible, or are they sitting closer to me? All these different little things that are lost when we're not seeing each other
Yeah.
in person. Think about these three big categories, and there's so much in your book. I mean, read it 3 times and still feel like you could read it again, to get a new perspective and new information. Has this work influenced you in your life and
Mhm.
your work,
Mhm.
and how you're approaching,
Mhm.
after
Mhm.
getting through this project?
Well, I definitely am much better able to see how very brain bound our culture is. That's a word that, again, that I borrowed from the philosopher Andy Clark. He talks about brain bound as the opposite or counter to the extended mind. Our culture is so very brain bound in the way we approach things like education and the work that we do in our workplace. And I recognize and realize how brain bound I have been for most of my life, and how much more dynamic and fruitful it is to bring in all these outside the brain resources. So I try to do that as much as possible now, to bring in my body, bring in my physical space of the physical surroundings, and bring in my social nature into my thinking. It doesn't come naturally to me, but that's what I like about the extended mind, is that it's a skill that can be cultivated, and so I'm trying.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you. It's really forward to learning more from you, and always
Thank you,
excited,
Diana.
what you're going to be on to next. You're an incredible science writer and creative
Thank
thinker.
you.
So thank you for bringing this
Thank
this book to life. I know, I imagine it was a lot of work.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure talking with you.